Shalom, you're watching Jerusalem Minute on JNS. My name is Josh Hasten. I am here with JNS CEO Alex Traiman. We are broadcasting to the world from Jerusalem, the eternal capital of the state of Israel and the Jewish people. Alex, how are you, my man?
Doing well today. Thanks, Josh.
So there's a lot to talk about now. It is approaching the 4-month, I don't want to call it an anniversary, but the 4-month date since the start of the war. Obviously, the October 7th massacre preceded the war, the ground operation in Gaza now taking place. Let's start by talking about what's going on right now in Gaza, an update, if you will, on the situation down in Gaza.
Sure. We know that Hamas killed 1,200 people, took over 200 people hostage into the Gaza Strip. The IDF, after a few weeks, went directly into north of Gaza. They pressed down through North Gaza. They pressed down through central Gaza. They told all the residents there to move towards the south. There was a pause in the middle of that fighting. Israel got back 110 hostages and then resumed fighting after that pause. Now most of the fighting concentrated in the south, most of the heaviest fighting in Khan Yunis right now, which is believed to be the last major stronghold of Hamas, where Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif and others are believed to be in hiding, and that's where most of the hostages are believed to be as well. Also fighting around the Rafah border as Israel tries to secure the border, this Philadelphia corridor between Egypt and Gaza. As this battle presses on, it gets more difficult, right? And we've seen that the IDF's taken losses along the way. 230 soldiers or so have been killed so far since Israel launched its ground incursion. The international community has given Israel a lot of leeway to fight until this point, but we are getting the sense that that window of international patience, particularly that of the United States, is waning.
So would you say, Alex, we are winning the war? Do you think Israel's winning the war? I mean, the hostages are still over 100 hostages still in Gaza. There's still thousands, perhaps, Hamas terrorists on the run, including their leadership, who we have not caught just yet. Are we winning?
Oh, I think absolutely. The IDF's reported that they've killed over 9,000 Hamas operatives. And if you look at the way the war's gone on the Israeli side, you've had 200 or so soldiers that have been killed in battle, but also Israel's absorbed many injuries on our side, and you'd have to imagine that also on the Hamas side, that there's been many injuries which basically incapacitate the ability of Hamas to fight. So the IDF has done something that it's never done anywhere in any of the territories around it, really leveling and decimating much of Gaza, really destroying much of the army of Hamas, taking out many of the senior leaders of Hamas, and now circling in on the remaining senior leadership. I think we have to see what happens in the next few weeks, but the idea that Israel's not winning this war, I mean, Israel's winning this war, and they're winning it big.
At the same time, you do have a lot of different rumors circulating in terms of ceasefire talks, perhaps another hostage exchange deal in the works, and these rumors have been going on now for probably several weeks. The last I heard was that the proposal that Israel put together, Hamas decided they're going to reject that proposal, but talks are still underway. You have Qatar involved, you have Egypt involved, the United States, of course, is involved. Secretary of State Blinken arriving today in Israel. What is your take on where we stand now in terms of a potential ceasefire? Also, is that a good idea or a bad idea for Israel?
Sure. I mean, well, the first pause that we had in the fighting was almost 2 weeks worth of pause, and Israel was able to secure over 110 hostages in return. And looking back, that was a very good deal, because we got hostages back that otherwise, they would still probably be in Gaza, and the pause was temporary. As soon as that pause ended, Israel just went right back into fighting. And yes, their strategic position was slightly more difficult when they restarted, but they've seemed to have overcome any of those handicaps. Now, talks regarding a similar hostage prisoner swap that would include a pause, they're talking about pause of many, many weeks. And you start to hear from the United States and others that if there will be a pause, they want a pause to be so long that it will make it difficult for Israel to restart fighting afterwards, because if the international community gets, let's say, 6 weeks of quiet, they're not necessarily going to accept that Israel would then restart hostilities afterwards. So there's a few things that are going on here with pressure on Israel to get back hostages. First, of course, is the families of the hostages themselves. They're putting tremendous pressure on the government to do everything in their power to bring back the captives, even if it means that the other goals of the war are left aside. And if you're the families of hostages, I mean, that's your job. Your job is to lobby for the government to bring your loved ones home. And yet you see that from the very beginning of this war, a lot of this anti-Netanyahu and anti-judicial reform protest that we've had in Israel, certainly this past summer against the judicial reforms, but even for several years against Netanyahu during these extended election campaigns, and we've had 5 elections in 4 years here in Israel, they latched on to this hostage issue from the first minute. And you see that there's a lot of signage and billboards all over Israel calling to, quote, bring them home. And on the one hand, that makes a lot of sense. Bring them home, but when you understand that it's actually not the government that is printing these posters, but rather it's part of this very strong and well-funded anti-Netanyahu movement that's printing these signages and posters, they're not saying to Hamas, release the hostages. They're saying to the government, bring them home, making it that the number one war goal, as far as they're concerned, is to get the hostages back and not to make sure that Hamas can never commit an atrocity like October 7th again. And at the same time, you also have international pressure, for there to be this ceasefire, that it won't start again, but also to bring the hostages home, because what this movement all wants to do, both the anti-Netanyahu domestic movement and the international community, what they want to do is to pin as much blame on this war, both the failings that led up to October 7th and on October 7th itself, and also the inability to get the hostages back. They want to pin this on Netanyahu. And everybody wants Netanyahu to be the fall guy for everything that's happened on October 7th and beyond.
Yeah, you're right. The campaign is not let them go. The campaign is bring them home. Obviously, trying to pressure our government. And as you mentioned, those other forces joining. And, of course, no judgment on the families themselves, who obviously have to do what is necessary. No judgment at all there. But unfortunately, you have those who are piggybacking on it, trying to bring down the government as we go forward. And there will be a day after the war when we start pointing fingers and whatnot, and that day is not now. And
yeah, Josh, but you're already starting to see billboards in Jerusalem and in Tel Aviv calling for elections now.
Right.
And there's no names or organizations that are signed on the bottom of these billboards. There's a campaign now which involves billboards and videos that says in Hebrew, they're red billboards with a picture of Netanyahu all in black. It says, Atah Rosh, Atah Hashem, you are the head, you are guilty. That are being blasted all over Israel right now. So it's very clear that they're trying to get as much domestic pressure to force Netanyahu out while the fighting is taking place. But I'll tell you, I think that ironically what this is actually doing is strengthening Netanyahu, both the domestic pressure and as well as the international pressure. And a lot of this pressure, as you know, and we'll discuss in a little bit, towards the creation of a Palestinian state. People have to remember that in this last election cycle, Israel formed a very strong right-wing government, and the right wing actually won in a landslide before October 7th. Even in the fourth election, when they got Netanyahu out, the Likud party won by 13 seats. It was an unprecedented victory. So this is a right-wing country. And if they feel that these left-wing elements are now pushing hard to get Netanyahu out, while the soldiers are putting their lives on the line to fight Hamas in Gaza, while there is a potential for a much larger war in the north with Hezbollah, and as the international community is now trading in the concept of land for peace and saying, yeah, we were lying about land for peace. We just want you to give up the land, even if the Palestinians cannot deliver any peace at all, as they proved on October 7th. I think all of this helps Netanyahu and his right-wing coalition partners realize that their political priority is to stay exactly where they are and not to give in and to go ahead and to try to win the war full-fledged.
So let's talk about what you mentioned. You touched on the world community led by the Biden administration, talking about a two-state solution. Just this past week, there were sanctions levied on 4 Jews, so-called settlers, by the U.S. government, essentially freezing their assets in the U.S., not letting them travel to the United States. Even some of Israel's banks, who are holding their accounts here, have decided that they're going to freeze their assets. In addition to that, you have, if you follow Twitter, or X as it's now known, you have high-level government officials in the U.S. Repeatedly talking about a two-state solution. As Hamas attacked Israel, as Israel is waging a defensive war, a necessary war to rid not only our region, but the entire world of the evil, which is Hamas, the focus, and again, we appreciate, of course, all the support from the Biden administration in terms of the financial support and military support and all that, but at the same time, they're talking about two-state solutions. They're sanctioning people. Who knows, this could, one day, we could arrive to a situation where they're sanctioning people who are simply supporting Judea and Samaria. They may turn their wrath against IDF soldiers who are defending residents of Judea and Samaria. So, where do you see this going? Number one, on the sanctions on those 4 individuals, and 2, for the future, in terms of, number one, potential IDF soldiers who might be under the gun, and also the all of this talk of a so-called Palestinian state.
Yeah, so this is a very slippery slope, what's taking place right now. And in the last year, even before October 7th, we started to hear more and more talk from the Biden administration about increasing amounts of quote-unquote settler violence. And what they're trying to do is to draw some equivalence between radical Jews living on hilltops in Judea and Samaria versus terrorists from organizations like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. One of these 4 Jews who was now sanctioned, they basically detained him during a riot in this town of UNRA. And if people will recall, there was about 4 horrific, deadly shootings by Palestinians of Jews just traversing this thoroughfare in Samaria that passes through this town of Huar that were shot and killed, were shot and very badly injured. And after one of these shootings, when it was clear that the army wasn't really securing the road, so some of the neighboring Jewish communities, they basically made their presence felt in that community, and there was a scuffle. There was some scuffling that went back and forth, but there can be no moral equivalence. There's no violent equivalence between what they're talking about of this quote-unquote settler violence and Hamas terrorism, Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorism. So the idea that the United States is always trying to find the counterbalance or to justify Palestinian terrorism on the basis of this so-called settler violence, when these episodes that are being classified are far fewer and far less extreme than the thousands of terror attacks targeting Jews with deadly force, all over Judea and Samaria. So the fact that the U.S. is even drawing this equivalence, raises some major red flags. But now you're in the middle of a war. Like you said, we're less than 4 months since October 7th, almost 4 months. And Hamas has just committed the worst barbaric atrocity in the history of the Jewish state, murdering 1,200 people in the most horrific and barbaric way, injuring thousands more, taking 230 or so hostages into the Gaza Strip. And now they're trying to say, well, these 4 guys, this guy maybe set a fire over here and he did that. And they're focusing their attention, their executive orders on now sanctioning Jews living in Judea and Samaria after this is what happened. That is it's a very, very dangerous move that the United States has taken. And like you said, it can lead to the slippery slope where they can start to go after people financing the buildings of homes or yeshivas or other things in Judea and Samaria. They could start sanctioning IDF soldiers that potentially arrested some terrorists in Judea and Samaria. Or not provide weapons, as they're talking about, to certain IDF units that may have been carrying out anti-terror operations in Judea and Samaria. So very slippery slope. But I think that one of the most disappointing elements of this entire story so far is that Bank Leumi, which is the state bank of Israel, and Bank Hapoalim, and the postal bank, the Bank of Dor, and others have said that they will freeze the accounts of these four individuals. And as far as I'm reading in all of the reports, none of these four individuals were convicted of crimes. So, one was held in administrative detention, one was suspected or like arrested and released for something. And so the idea that now Israeli banks would sanction and freeze these individuals' accounts on the basis of these U.S. accusations, I think is very, very disappointing.
Yeah, I think it's despicable that the local banks here in Israel are riding the coattails of a foreign government, even if they are our friends, riding their coattails and freezing local accounts. You mentioned the attacks on Israelis, and I think it's the Rescuers Without Borders organization reported in 2023 that there were over 6,000 attacks by Arabs against Jews throughout Judea, Samaria, and in the Jerusalem area. But of course, there are no sanctions on any of those terrorists, only on these four individuals.
Correct.
I would look at, just you're talking about violence and sanctioning people. Look what happened. There was a riot in New York the other day, and policemen were attacked, and individuals who were, I think, temporarily detained, foreigners, people who didn't even have U.S. citizenship. I think they got off the hook. And if you just look at any weekend in places like Chicago, like there are like 5, 10, 15 murders in a weekend in the south side of Chicago, and I don't see any sanctioning or freezing accounts or this and that.
Sure.
Violence is violence, but yet the obsession is there.
And if you want to look about the Palestinian Authority,
residents,
and if you want to look at the Palestinian Authority, because they are talking about Palestinian state, and I think that we should touch on that in a second. The Palestinian Authority on the books has a terror financing scheme, which has been dubbed Pay for Slay. With Sander Gerber in the United States that pushed this concept of pay for slay. People didn't realize it, and the United States passed this Taylor Force Act. But basically, the Palestinian Authority on the books is paying terrorists that are sitting in Israeli jails for committing acts of terror, in many cases first-degree murder or attempted first-degree murder, and they're paying them salaries for life for sitting in Israeli prisons. And if terrorists are killed in the act of committing first-degree murder, the Palestinian Authority is paying stipends to those families of the quote-unquote martyred terrorists, called the Martyrs Fund. And the U.S. Congress passed the Taylor Force Act to basically say you cannot send money to the Palestinian Authority as long as these terror payments are on the books. So the Palestinian Authority is literally financing terrorism against Jews, in addition to all the incitement that's on the televisions and the textbooks and the public speeches and naming public squares after terrorists inside Judea and Samaria. And yet the United States is looking for ways to draw more money towards the Palestinian Authority, and yet here they turn around and they sanction, four poor Jews, basically, that are living on hilltops, essentially, in houses or on a farm or whatever it is, and saying that these are the obstacles to peace in the entire Middle East.
Yeah, it should be noted, by the way, the Pay to Slay program, the more Jews you kill, the more money you make per month, the more money your family makes per month. It's a sliding scale. The more carnage you create, the more carnage and more
This is
bloodshed.
on the books. It's been
policy.
very well documented exactly how much money is going, who it's going to. I mean, this is
charts.
Yeah. So, it's quite hypocritical right now. And again, the idea that now that the administration in the United States is going to say that the outcome of this horrific Hamas attack is going to be that the Palestinians will get a state at the end of the day. I mean, I don't think that there's one Israeli today, or let's take it back. 95% of Israelis today would agree that a Palestinian state cannot and should not be the likely outcome of what happened on October 7th. And yet Biden, Antony Blinken, who's now coming to the region, have said over and over and over again that they want to push towards a Palestinian state. And now in the last weeks, we had David Cameron, who's the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, as well as members of the State Department, basically looking for ways in which they could recognize Palestinian statehood even if the Palestinians don't make any commitments whatsoever towards peace.
And without Israel's consent, even.
Exactly.
Just do it.
Yeah, exactly. So this is it's a very, very dangerous situation diplomatically that Israel's in right now.
Yeah, I think the sovereignty movement released statistics about a week ago or so. I think it was about 8 out of 10 Israelis, around 80% on the books there, and in their study said that they were opposed to a PA state, especially now in lieu of the October 7th massacre. You talked about funding the Palestinian Authority. You also have the issue of funding UNRWA, the UN Relief Workers Work Agency, which is essentially has been for 76 years supposed to be helping so-called refugees from the War of Independence, the Israel's War of Independence in 1948. Yet UNRWA has been holding Arabs as pawns on the front lines against Israel for 76. I don't think they've resettled even one so-called refugee. You have governments now who are waking up to the fact that UNRWA is bad news with proof that some of the UNRWA representatives either directly were involved in the October 7th massacre or supported the October 7th massacre. So you have countries who are defunding UNRWA. At the same time, you have other countries who are stepping up, I think some Middle Eastern countries and whatnot, who have decided that they are going to continue funding UNRWA. And if you look on X, Twitter, you see that UNRWA is pleading essentially for more and more funding, claiming that they are the source of humanitarian aid and they must be funded. But this is a corrupt organization. We've known this for a long time, even before October 7th. What do you think is going to happen in terms of the world community and their support of UNRWA? You know, the Trump administration pulled support. That right now, currently, I mean, Biden reinstated it. Right now, the U.S. has frozen support along with, I think 7 or 8 other countries. How do you see a future there with UNRWA claiming that they are all about helping the Arabs when, in fact, they're doing the exact opposite?
Yeah, UNRWA has been perpetuating the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis since 1948. This is very important. People should know UNRWA has a budget of $1.6 billion. Okay, they are the #1 employer of Palestinians in Judea and Samaria. So what they're and Gaza, what they're not trying to remove the status of refugees. This is the only refugee crisis in the entire world that has its own UN agency, and yet this agency does not resettle or end the refugee status of these individuals. The refugee status is lifelong, and not only is it lifelong, but it actually carries over to second, third, and now even fourth generation. Not to mention that all these refugees live in the country that supposedly they were kicked out of. You've got a very, very serious problem here. And I saw one report that the average salary of an UNRWA worker is over $100,000, which is an extraordinary amount of money in these territories. And you have now some countries which have said that they are temporarily pausing funding of UNRWA, and they've called on the United Nations to conduct an investigation into the neutrality of UNRWA, as Israel has put forward some significant evidence, as you mentioned, that some UNRWA employees directly participated in the October 7th massacre. But it's not clear that funding or that defunding of UNRWA by these nations will be permanent. And if you look at who was put on the committee to investigate the UNRWA's participation in October 7th attack, you have 3 noted anti-Israel adjudicators that are essentially doing that investigation. So I don't think that we should count on UNRWA being defunded long term. And even if UNRWA somehow does get defunded long term, that doesn't mean that funding is not going to be funneled into Palestinian territories and into Gaza. I think we can be certain that in the months and years ahead, the amount of funding that's going to pour into Gaza is going to be unprecedented compared to what the incredible amounts of funding that have been poured into Gaza and elsewhere before October 7th.
Let's, I agree with you, absolutely. Yeah, let's look to the region a little bit, starting by focusing on northern Israel right now. We have the war in the south. Northern Israel is heating up. Just the other day, I think there were several dozen rockets fired by Hezbollah or other terrorist groups from Lebanon into northern Israel. Israel responding with artillery and targeting specific sites. I know a bunch of Hezbollah terrorists have been killed. Where are we now in terms of the situation in the north? And I want to talk about the greater Middle East as well.
Well, the situation in the north has been tense since October 8th, and there's been almost nonstop firing by Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and Israeli positions, both civilian and military. They've hit several military lookouts that the IDF uses as bases of operations to monitor what's going on inside Lebanon. There's been hundreds of cross-border attacks, firing of anti-tank guided missiles, drones, other types of mortars being fired across the border. And the Israeli Air Force has been extremely active, also hitting back at positions nonstop. And you have yesterday, or earlier this week, you had Amos Hasten, who's the U.S. Special Envoy, envoy of the Biden administration. He was the one who negotiated Israel's transfer of a large natural gas reserves to Lebanon when Yair Lapid was prime minister for just a few months, and that they transferred this over. And we Israelis were told at the time that this was going to avoid a major war between Israel and Hezbollah. And yet here we are just a year later, and Israel's never been closer to all-out war with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And in the very beginning of the war, Israel evacuated tens of thousands of Israeli citizens from a 5-kilometer radius below the Lebanese border, evacuated numerous towns, and these individuals have been living in hotels and guest houses for 4 months now. And the question is, how can you possibly return them to their homes if the threat of war remains? And so the Israeli military, Defense Minister Gallant and others have been paying lip service to the diplomacy that Hasten and Blinken now are trying to carry out, which would essentially enforce UN Resolution 1701, which is supposed to make southern Lebanon a demilitarized zone. It was UNIFIL, a UN agency that was supposed to guarantee that Hezbollah wouldn't be in southern Lebanon. Of course, they failed in their mission. And so diplomatic efforts are now based towards getting Hezbollah to retreat up to 20 to 30 kilometers north of that border. Israel's paying lip service to this diplomatic process, and I think part of the reason why they're doing that is because they have decided that it is in their best interest to fight one front at a time. And meanwhile, they're still fighting heavily inside Gaza against Hamas. And what they want to do is, wrap up the operations there so that they can then move equipment and troops to the north for the potential ground incursion into southern Lebanon. And also, if you just look at the calendar, right now we're in the beginning of February. It's the coldest time of the year. There could be snow in Lebanon at this time of year. It's been raining here in Israel for the last couple of weeks, and it's not ideal conditions. So there's the sense that they want to wait until they conclude some of the operations in Gaza, and also wait until springtime. And the likelihood of Israeli incursion into southern Lebanon, I think at this point is greater than ever. Although with every day that they haven't done it, there could be increasing pressures to prevent them from doing so.
Yeah, the rumor is a spring or summer war potentially in the north. You mentioned the gas reserves deal last year and the UN resolution. We can definitely question those looking at the situation right now, as we can also question Israel's decision in 2005 to expel every last Jew out of Gaza. Here we are in 2024 following the massacre of 1,200 Israelis in the south and the 200-plus soldiers who were killed. And I think it's 100,000 Israelis currently living outside of their homes, both in the north and in the south. As we are getting ready to wrap up, we're almost out of time, but I just want to focus on one last topic here. You had 3 U.S. servicemen who were killed in an attack by pro-Iranian. I think the Houthis were responsible for that attack. You had the U.S., even in the last several days, hitting time and time again targets throughout the Middle East, whether in Iraq or in other places right now. Do you think this U.S. response to the killing of 3 servicemen, is this just symbolic, or is this actually making a difference in the, dare I say it, the war on terror, which seems to be spreading throughout the Middle East? What do you think about that?
Well, you mentioned that 3 servicemen and 25 injured in Jordan, near the Jordan-Syrian border by a Iranian terror organization, Kataib Hezbollah, which is one of many Iranian terror agencies in the region. And there's been more than 100 attacks on U.S. infrastructure in Iraq, in Syria, in Jordan, in and around Yemen, strikes by Houthis on and towards U.S. naval vessels in the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea. So the U.S. has been absorbing a lot of hits, direct hits, and also attacks that they've fought back. And now we are beginning to see some striking back at some of the capabilities of Houthis and others. The U.S. has been very hesitant to attack inside Iran or to attack direct representatives of the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, but rather to target some of the second or third degree, more loosely affiliated proxies that are funded by Iran. And we have to see whether these attacks are going to be enough to deter further attacks. By all accounts, from what we're seeing, each one of these attacks is leading Iran and its proxies to test the waters a little bit more. And that's what we've seen between Israel and Hezbollah in the northern border, and that's what we're seeing now between Houthis and U.S. and U.K. forces in the Red Sea, and between U.S. and Iranian forces, is that you're starting to just see the amount of violence slowly but slowly intensify, while the United States continues to say that they're not seeking an escalation, but they're building towards an escalation.
Well, that's probably going to wrap it up for today. I mean, folks, this is just the tip of the iceberg. This just gives you a sense of just 1 week of news here in Israel, maybe even less. So much going on here. This is Jerusalem Minute on JNS TV. Shout out to Ryan Lifshitz, who's behind the scenes doing a great job here as our engineer. Go to jns.org for all the latest news from Israel. Make sure you tune into JNS TV on YouTube. My name is Josh Hasten here in Jerusalem with Alex Traiman, CEO of JNS, at jns.org. Coming to you from Israel's eternal capital, the city of Jerusalem. Have a great week, everyone. Be safe, and thanks so much, Alex, for joining us here today.
Thanks, Josh.